To me, it seems like he's not really actually arguing for free will. He's more assuming that we have it, though he is countering arguments against free will in favor of determinism, that usually the ones that come from neuroscience, something that he as a psychologist knows more about.
One of the things he's interesting on is the connection between a sort of self-conscious agency, that is a self-consciousness of oneself as an agent, as a cause in the world, or a belief of oneself as an agent or a cause in the world, and psychological health.
To the extent that people believe that they are kind of destined or fated to suffer from this illness, with, from obesity to depression to you name it, they're also, their outcomes aren't as good. And there are experimental findings and intervention findings that suggest that when you change their mind about that, then you see corresponding changes in their actual activation toward goals.
To his credit, he thinks people can have a false picture of themselves. But what's not, I think, to his credit is that there is this point of choice, a key point of choice that, Gena, that you were talking about of intellectual honesty or integrity, where you have a choice to try to choose facts.
Welcome to the ARU Bookshelf, the podcast where faculty members of the Ayn Rand University discuss books they are reading on intellectual topics. With me today are Greg Salmieri. Greg is a senior scholar of philosophy at the Salem Center at the University of Texas. He's also the editor of the companion to Ayn Rand from Blackwell. Jason Rheins, who is a colleague of mine at the Ayn Rand Institute. He's a fellow and instructor at ARI, formerly a philosophy professor. And Gena Gorlin, who is a clinical associate professor of psychology, also at the University of Texas. As it happens, we're all in Austin on this particular episode, but joined electronically because it's very cold outside. This week, we are talking about a book by Kennon Sheldon called Freely Determined: What the New Psychology of the Self Teaches Us About How to Live. And this is one of many, a number of books that have come out recently on the topic of free will. There have been a number, both pro and con, come out in the last year or two. This book is pro. We may have occasion to discuss some of the other books on later episodes. But just to tell you a bit about Sheldon and about the book, I want to give an overview of it just before we get into our discussion of it. Sheldon is a professor of psychology at the University of Missouri. He's noteworthy for his research on something called self-determination theory, which I think we'll talk about later today because that features prominently in the book itself. And one interesting thing about him, at least that I glean from the reading of the book, is that even though this book is sponsored in part by, it looks like, the Templeton Foundation, which is known for for supporting research on free will, perhaps for religious reasons, it looks like Sheldon is a secular thinker. He admits to being not believing in any deities or supernatural entities. He thinks free will can and should be defended on scientific grounds, on secular scientific grounds. That's one of the things very interesting about this book. And what does he say about it? Well, one thing he claims, again, very distinctive for a secular scientific thinker in today's intellectual landscape, is that we have a radical form of free will, and a kind of free will that we have, a kind of control that we have and exercise over our entire character. The opening quote in the book is taken from Erich Fromm, who was, I think, a kind of existentialist. He says, "Man's main task in life is to give birth to himself, to become what he potentially is. The most important product of his effort is his own personality." That is a thesis that's central to this book, and certainly one we're going to talk about today. He claims that we have this radical form of free will. One thing we'll want to talk about today, I'm sure, is what kind of argument, if any, is he actually giving for this view. To me, it seems like he's not really actually arguing for free will. He's more assuming that we have it, deferring to other philosophers like Christian List, who've made arguments, though he is countering arguments against free will in favor of determinism, that usually the ones that come from neuroscience, something that he as a psychologist knows more about. Much more of the focus of the book is, as he puts it on page 10, how the choice-making architecture actually works. So he's more interested in showing what psychology, especially his research areas in psychology, have to say about what free will is and how it works than he is about trying to defend that we have it. And one central component, I think, of what he's presenting about how free will works is how it fits into what it is to make wise choices. And that's, I think, what the subtitle of the book is getting at, what the new psychology of the self teaches us about how to live. He thinks that a lot of the psychological research that he's conversant with already assumes that people make choices and that they can make better ones. And he thinks central to making better choices is making choices that give us more agency, a better sense of actually using our free will, as opposed to making excuses, pretending we don't have free will, adopting determinism as a kind of rationalization. And he talks about all kinds of areas of research that show when we are more identified with our choices, the value of the choices, ones that we think are ones that, as he puts it, intrinsically motivate us, the happier we can be, the more well-being we can have. Whereas if we're motivated by extrinsic activities where it seems like we're not the ones under control, we're not the ones in control, that is less conducive to our well-being. That relates to this self-determination theory that he is an advocate of. So that, I think, that's my overview of the major contours of the book. And I guess I'll just kick off the discussion by asking people, what did you like about this book? What were your takeaways? What didn't you like? What would you do without? Are there any other major elements of the book that I didn't mention that you think we should talk about? So who wants to go first?
So I think there's a lot that well, this is really a book. It's a couple books in one. I don't really think of it as one book fits all on sort of one theme. It's sort of like, what have I been working on the last 20 or 30 years? And it's initially framed like it's all going to be about, well, there is a through line through it all about autonomy, or as feeling as if we have control, the benefits of feeling as if we have control, and various ways we might think of control, although in terms of specifically our motivations and then our actions. What I actually don't, so I neither think there's a defense of free will in this book, like any argument that we actually have it, or even any reason why, here's why I think we have it. And I also don't think that he ever really describes what our choices are. So he rejects a kind of reductionism or an kind of epiphenomenalism where it's just the atoms of our bodies and so on. He has a notion that there is top down. So, second series, system 2 to system 1 to your brain, or whatever it is.
People might not know those terms if they haven't read the book.
So different, subconscious, conscious. But the thing is he never actually says in what specific ways. He shows people shifting their values around. He never kind of says what choices are they making. And in fact, a lot of the experiments that he cites, especially his own, seem to be, in my view, though he's on the side of free will and self-determination, at a kind of methodological or procedural way, they become determinist again, in the sense that he thinks there's this mechanism that adults have, that you come to have more identified motivation rather than interjected. There's this mechanism whereby the organism comes to know that this isn't really good for it, or it is, and then starts to improve. And you would think that some of these would actually be saying, well, actually, of course, we don't see everybody in the groups doing this, either the control or experimental group. In fact, here's a reason to think they're making a choice about blank, and making that choice impacted something. But you never get anything like that.
Can I jump in now that I'm not muted?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Jason. And I should say, as a kind of self-disclosure in part, that Sheldon is one of my favorite researchers within the field to cite. And Greg and probably all of you at various points have heard me prattling on about self-determination theory and introjects, and it's become part of my day-to-day discourse, to the point that my husband and I joke around about, oh, you just gave our daughter her first introject. So he's actually had quite a bit of influence on me, or at least it seems like he has, in that, whether or not it's epiphenomenal in the end, like I've adopted some of the terminology to describe things that I probably already had my own conceptual framework for. So with all of that said, and I'd love to unpack that at some point in this conversation, like, what actually has influenced like my thinking, and what could influence our thinking for the better, or potentially for the worse, kind of in this framework. Is there anything new here? Do we learn anything from the research findings? And I can speak to what I think I learned, and we can interrogate it. But to start just at a bigger picture level, to what you're saying, Jason, about the arguments he doesn't make, and kind of what's blatantly missing by way of a defense of free will or an explanation of it, kind of its etiology. I think what we're seeing is an attempt to break through his own methodological commitments and limitations, of which you referenced, these commitments to both evolutionary psychology with all the baggage that brings, to empiricism, which we can talk more about. And yet, I think what he's trying to tell us is, hey, we can introspect this. And I think you see this come up in various forms throughout the book, when he's providing the anecdotal, the kind of hypothetical anecdote he returns to throughout the book of the athlete who's deciding in that kind of, split second whether to pass the ball to another player on his team, or to take the shot, even though, it's unlikely to go in. But then, like, what are all the different factors that might come into play, and ultimately in what way is it still his choice, kind of irreducibly his choice? When he's describing that situation and experience, and when he's interpreting the findings of his various research studies, and when he's describing his own experience as he's writing the book and something occurs to him to use as an example, and then, when he kind of instructs himself to look for examples of this phenomenon, and then one occurs to him and then he decides to put it in, and then that sort of shapes, I think he's trying to get away with an introspective argument, which I think we all would ultimately agree is at least an irreducible part of an argument one can make in favor of free will. Like, we wouldn't know without introspection that there's such a thing as free will. And yet he doesn't ultimately have the methodological purchase or or resources to explicitly make that argument. So yeah, I'm curious what you all think about that.
Well, I'd go further maybe defense of him, or how one thinks about it. I don't think there is an argument for free will in the end.
Yeah.
Free will is not something we know by argument. You can directly introspect having it. And there are lots of arguments around it as to what its status in our knowledge is, how other knowledge depends on it. I think there's lots of arguments about free will, but the basic fact of free will, I think, is not something to be argued for. It's something to be noticed. And so we can't fault someone for noticing it and not arguing for it. Now, when he comes up against the kind of philosophical issues, I don't think he has arguments in all the places where he would need them to be writing a book on philosophy. But I still found the book really interesting. I think it's heartening to see him use the kinds of examples that you talk about. And I think he says thoughtful things about them, and about how the mechanisms that there are in our mind, because there certainly are mechanisms, not everything is chosen, how you can think about them in light of a background assumption that there's free will. And then he says first pass things, but I think important first pass things for a psychologist to be saying, about what's wrong with the reasons that people think we can't have free will. And there's a lot more to say on each of them, but that's the job for a book by a philosopher.
Greg, for the benefit of our audience, could you say a little bit more about why you think free will isn't the kind of thing you would be able to argue for, and why that doesn't mean it's just then an act of faith to believe in it?
I think we can directly observe ourselves choosing. I think choosing is what free will is. And I think it is our observation of our choosing and our knowledge that we can choose that knowledge is presupposed by the act of argument. So there are two things. Any argument for it, I think, is question begging. That is, it's presupposing what it's meant to prove, because any argument, I think, presupposes that you have free will, whether it's for or against it. And then secondarily, I think we don't need an argument for it because we can directly observe it, just like you don't need an argument that you exist, or that you're feeling a chair beneath you when you're sitting in a chair when you feel it. These aren't things that are argued to. They're things from which arguments start.
So I want to say I don't disagree with any of that. I was using argument in the sense of presenting some kind of validation, or just saying why we think it's true, why I think it's true. And he doesn't even say, well, I just make a choice and that's real, and that, and so on. And I think it's true that any attempt to say demonstrate or prove it from other considerations has the problem that the whole idea of a proof and why there's a point to it is that you present reasons, you give evidence, and at the end you can choose to accept that. So what is in your mind is based on reasons to think that it's so in the world. And if you can't make that choice, then the output is just the output of inputs. And it's not reasoning at all. But so I don't think there's a statement of, hey, this is a reason to think blah, 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 that we have free will, or this is why, we just see it. You don't say that. He doesn't say that. Okay, but isn't he at least showing us all these ways that we have it? So you could do that work. Well, I think it's very important that at the outset, he leaves open, look, maybe it turns out determinism's true. But when we assume it's true, it has these negative consequences. And I'm going to, attack some of the reasons that people favor determinism, but though he leaves out, I think, some of the strongest parts of the arsenal. Now, but here's where I think, and again, this is a very interesting book, and he is on the side of the angels, and I'm inclined to try to like what he's trying to do, but I don't think it works. And that is, what wouldn't you do if you were not yet convinced that determinism was false, that the will was free? Well, I don't think what you would do is set out and say, well, exactly what are the loci of choice? Now, you kind of get that through these loci of different systems of control and motivation, but he isn't sort of looking at like, well, do you have choice about that? Do you have choice over this? What if you don't? That's not a problem. You have it here or there. And or you stop and you go, wait a minute. I'm running these experiments, and I know that people have free will. I should assume that some of the people are doing this for this reason, and others might choose not to, if I think that's something that is up to us. And I don't think you see that. And the last thing I'll say on this is he has a sort of definition of what he takes to suffice for free will. He gets it from a philosopher named List. Basically, List's list of three things. You have to be able to consider alternatives, to resolve upon one, and then to act upon that resolution. Any compatibilist can say that different things come before your mind. There's some way that you become set on one, and then you do it. It's everything turns on, why do you consider these ones? Could you consider other alternatives? Could you put it away for now? And then how do you resolve upon? How does that get made?
So
back up
Jason,
a bit about and talk about just some of the terminology here and some of the different views there are, because we're talking about compatibilism, soft determinism, hard determinism, deliberation. Just so the here's how I would sort of frame this. There's the ancient idea that there's a conflict between the fact or seeming fact that we make choices and that our choices change the future, with the thought fact that the future is determined by the past. So that everything that will happen in the future is already set necessarily to be what it's going to be by antecedent causes. That view that the future is set by the past, that at any moment the whole future is already, fated or set to happen or already kind of in store for us, is called determinism. And ever since the time of the Greek Stoics, there was the idea that maybe, even though that view seems to be in tension with the observed or thought fact that we have choices and therefore there are different futures open to us, maybe these facts are compatible after all. And the Stoics have, and many, many generations of philosophers from many schools since, have tried to show that these two things, determinism and choice or free will, or what's up to us, as the Greeks put it, that these things are compatible despite initial appearances that they're not. And that view is called compatibilism or soft determinism, as opposed to hard determinism or incompatibilist determinism, the view that the future being determined by the past is, one, not compatible with free will, and two, true, so that determinism is true and we don't have free will, and also as opposed to what's sometimes called libertarianism or incompatibilist defenses of free will, the view that those two things are incompatible. If we have free will, the future can't be set by the past, and we do have free will, so the future isn't uniquely set and determined by the past. So what's going on in this view? I'm an incompatibilist. I believe in free will. I think all of us here do. And incompatibilists have always reacted to the Stoics and later compatibilists by saying, you're making these things seem compatible by simply redefining some of them. If you mean by choice something other than what we mean by choice, like you end up doing what you wanted to do, well, sure, that's compatible with things being predetermined, but that's not what choice means. And so any definition one gives of free will, any definition one gives of choice, any definition one gives of moral responsibility, which is a related term, you could just jigger with the words in that definition and therefore make it compatible with determinism. There's no definition that's immune from that kind of hucksterism. And if incompatibilism is true, that's hucksterism. That's changing the meanings of the terms. So I don't think there's any safe kind of criteria for free will that you can't, you can put out some set of sentences. If this is true, we have free will. Then like a month later, someone will publish a new compatibilist article trying to do away with that. So I agree that Sheldon is not sort of aware enough of that and doesn't correct against it. And his target isn't exactly compatibilism. But I think it's clear that he's not himself a compatibilist. He thinks there's something wrong with it. He doesn't know if he has the full resources to argue against that. But what he wants to say, and I think this is probably what one should say if one's in the field of moral philosophy or if one's in the field of psychology, we have free will. We have this robust thing, this ability to choose. We have a kind of causation that starts from our consciousness and emanates outward, etc. If you want to think it's compatible with determinism, that's on you. Try to show that that's compatible. But I don't think it can be. And I think that's the way to think about it. I think that's sort of dispositionally where Sheldon is, but he's a little vague on it. But then I think everybody is.
So I think this relates to the thing I was saying before about the question is, what is he trying to do in this book? Is he really trying to make an argument of his own, or is he taking something on board as an assumption and deferring to the philosophers? And that Christian List's position, I think, is itself compatibilist. So yeah. But I think you're right, Greg, that he isn't conversant with these different concepts in philosophy, and thank you for summarizing those for us. But I think you're right, though, that the spirit of what he's saying is very much incompatibilist, in that when he says, what I mean by free will is that there's a future that we can determine for ourselves. And yeah, you're probably right. There's compatibilists out there who could even take that language and spin it in their way. One other thing I wanted to add just about his dealing with the philosophy is, even though I agree with Jason that when it comes to grappling with the philosophical arguments against free will, he's playing fast and loose, or just not taking them very seriously, especially the ones about the predictive power of science. The determinists have half a dozen different responses to his responses. But where I think he is good is answering the arguments against free will that come from the special sciences, especially from psychology. So I think he has pretty good answers to the people who use the Libet experiments, for example, as evidence against free will. These are the much talked about, in part because they were popularized by Sam Harris, experiments from neuroscience where you do an EEG on people and tell them to flick their wrist at a certain time, and then ask them, what time did you decide to flick your wrist? And it turns out that the brain measures a spike in activity some microseconds before the self-reported time when they think they made the decision. And Sheldon has pretty good answers to that, saying that would only count as evidence against free will if it's the flicking your wrist time decision that you thought was the locus of free will. And the locus is probably before that. It's when you're forming the intention to participate in the experiment in the first place. And so, Jason, while I agree with you that he doesn't say a lot about what the actual locus of free will is and what the things we have choice over fundamentally are, he does say some things about what they aren't. And he narrows the field a bit. And you kind of have to do that if you're going to respond to Libet, which I think he's doing. And then the other thing that I think he's pretty good on is answering a particular argument that Sam Harris makes. And it's not really an argument that Harris makes, but it's a claim he makes, at least, about he draws on these examples from psychopathology and from neurological damage, where someone is operating at diminished capacity, like if they have a brain tumor, like the Whitman case, the Charles Whitman case, the shooter at University of Texas who shot a bunch of people from the tower, and then it turned out later on he had a brain tumor. And Sam Harris is basically saying, well, if you find someone has damage, wouldn't that makes you think they didn't have free will control, so we let you off the hook? And well, aren't we all that way? And Sheldon, I think, very reasonably says, well, there's a very good reason why you can decide that someone has diminished capacity and lacks full control over what they're doing when there's damage. But there's a norm at stake here. And if they're in a healthy state, we can say, yes, they've now fulfilled all the necessary conditions for having free will. But if they're missing one of those necessary conditions, then of course they're not. So I think he's very good on that. And so he's good on what you would expect him to be good on, which is knowing like the relevant neuroscience and its actual relevance to this philosophical question. Hashing out all the philosophical implications, perhaps maybe that's not his game.
Here's something that concerns me, and why I keep coming back to something is, it's not just, hey, he can't do this philosophy thing, but he's doing this other thing. And an enormous part of our power of choice isn't just in what we do. It isn't directly in what we value, like we just choose to value something the way the existentialists think. It's in choosing to think and how we think and taking control of our minds. And it's here, specifically the role of ideas and beliefs, where he's really weak. You would think he would draw on CBT. You would think he would draw upon, well, if you change what you believe about this, affect would change. None of that, right? Doesn't come up. In various experiments, it seems like where anybody who thought ideas really matter, and in terms of these results, would raise a question that he never raises, like maybe the reason these people so there's a point where he's talking about first people are like students signing up to do some new habit or something for a month, something like that. They state their goals, and those can be what he calls intrinsic motivations, just like, I just love doing it, or I think it's important, right? Or kind of external motivation, like money or more likes on Facebook or whatever. And people, he says, first, like it turns out that in terms of what they actually prefer, can get some of this stuff wrong. But interestingly, when you bring them back, and they tend to report more of the internal stuff, even if that's not really what's motivating them. Then you bring them back a month later. People don't remember what they said, but they way over suggest it was internal motivation. So way more come back and be like, oh, I picked the thing that like was meaningful, and rather than just get rich. Well, guess like you might think maybe the fact that our society says the pursuit of money is spiritually null or worse, and says helping the community is meaningful and good, maybe that's part of why people are saying this. And that he just does. Now, I didn't read the specific papers. Maybe some of that comes up in the methodology, but it seems a pretty big thing not to mention.
So can I jump in? So I've read some of the papers and some of the methodology, at least. So again, my response, Jason, will be of the form, I grant basically every criticism. I think there's a lot that's missing and also a lot that's wrong, crimes of both omission and commission, in his view. And what I've reaped from it is the distinct sort of value that I think he brings that's missing from a lot of other sources. So to take your example of, where's the CBT? Like, where's all the cognitive restructuring and changing your beliefs and rethinking them? I think you're right. And this is one of, I've always kind of had flagged for myself about his framework that there's really not enough accounting of like the cognitive interface with reality, like that aspect of, our volition. And what he and his research team really emphasize that you don't really find in CBT is the importance of how we choose our goals and values in the first place, and that there can be better and worse goals to choose, and that being able to let me finish, and that being able to introspect and really kind of get in relationship to our own implicit needs and strivings and longings, and in a certain way to our human nature, these fundamental needs we have for competence or efficacy, for autonomy, for that sense of choosing for ourselves, that it really makes a difference whether you choose goals that will serve those needs and that will form part of a life in which they can be integrated, such that life generally kind of moves you in the direction of growth and well-being, or not. And that actually is a pretty distinctive perspective within psychology. And I think a lot of his descriptive and even empirical work to conceptualize it, to characterize what that looks like, is actually really helpful. Like, it's been helpful to me clinically, even just in like really brief ways to probe clients on their own internal conflicts where they might just not have had access otherwise to the fact that, I am really actually doing this out of a sense of guilt. And where is that, based on what underlying value? I can't really say. It just sort of comes down to like, I'll be a bad person if, like he's been really helpful in that way.
But you knew you could tell a client, it sounds like you're doing that out of guilt, and you didn't have to say interjected motives.
Well, she knew it.
Well, this is what I mean. I'm not sure. Yeah.
When
Greg,
she was,
go ahead. Speak to the history.
23 in graduate school, or like, a couple of weeks before she read this book, because so I think two things we should distinguish. One is Sheldon's work and what we've learned from it, and with it, the broader school that he's a part of DC and Ryan are the kind of prime movers of this, and Sheldon's a sort of next generation disciple of them. Not that he hasn't done some of his own research, but so that school of thought and Sheldon's role in it versus this book, which is a kind of popularization of that work in connection to the free will debate. Gena and I'll add, I have learned a fair amount from reading Sheldon in particular and DC and Ryan also in the past, prior to this book. And then there's this book. So those kind of get packaged together and we have to separate them. But even if we learned something from him prior to this book, and then we didn't need this book to know it, we still might have learned it from him, and this book might be a good place for someone else to learn it. So there's that, but then there's also the thing I think we should think about. So Gena and I, who are the more fans of Sheldon, have to be objective about what we're getting from this book versus other things he wrote. But another thing we should be thinking about too is like, what are we in the business of reading these things for? When we're discussing them on this podcast, and just in general, what are we in the business of reading for? Because there's no shortage of things wrong with almost any book you're going to read. And I don't want to paper them over and say, well, if you can find anything right with the book, then don't pay attention to what's wrong with it. What's wrong with things matters, and what's distinctive about one's own view matters, and so forth. But more and more, I'm looking for, given that there's going to be something wrong in almost everything, what is there that I think is right here? What is here either that I can learn from, or that I can, if I'm not learning something new or fresh from it, think would be helpful in convincing or showing other people or in fleshing something out. One I wanted to raise, and maybe this will bring a lot of the topics together, is all the material about, roughly you could put it, believing you're determined is bad for you, right? So we have a need for agency, believing that we are deterministic beings, has negative effects on our belief in agency, and therefore leads to various bad outcomes. There's a set of questions about that. Is that true? Is the research for it any good? How does it relate to the philosophical reasons for believing there's free will, and so forth? But I think one of the things he's interesting on, and the self-determination theorists in general are interesting on, is the connection between a sort of self-conscious agency, that is a self-consciousness of oneself as an agent, as a cause in the world, or a belief of oneself as an agent or a cause in the world, and psychological health. And, let me just introduce it as a topic.
So one thing I should mention here is, and Gena, I'd be especially interested to hear your reactions to this, the very first big study that he cites, purporting to offer evidence that a belief in determinism is bad for you, causes you to be a disreputable person, is this Kathleen Vose and Jonathan Schooler 2008 study. And I remember when that came out and thinking, "Ooh, this is pretty cool." And then I remember 7 years later, there was this reproducibility crisis, and your old professor at Virginia, Gena, what is his name?
Brian Nosek.
This was one of the papers that he surveyed and couldn't replicate. And I went to his website recently to see if there, since 2015, have there been any replication attempts? And there was one in 2019, and they did not replicate the major data. There was some effect, but not as big as what Vose and Schooler said. And I was surprised that he didn't mention this in the footnotes in the book, even though the book is written after all of this controversy. He's just kind of taking this. Now, he does mention the later Baumeister Massacampo DeWall experiment 2009. Maybe that was a little different. Maybe that did replicate. I don't know. But what's your understanding of this literature, Gena?
Yeah. So to me, this is a fairly robust finding, partly because it hasn't been the exclusive province of any one research group. So Vose and Schooler were studying it, if I remember, I'm kind of fuzzy on the details, but they were studying it in a context of a kind of research program concerning itself with self-control and, kind of interfacing with Baumeister and his various efforts to operationalize the ability to kind of inhibit your impulses and how that gets depleted, which also hasn't been well replicated. Whereas these findings, you also see similar findings within the sort of psychiatry literature on beliefs in kind of any form of essentialism, whether it's genetic essentialism, whether it's just kind of a fixed mindsets around a mental health diagnosis. And you see the same kind of finding over and over, that to the extent that people believe that they are kind of destined or fated to suffer from this illness, with from obesity to depression to you name it, they're also their outcomes aren't as good. And there are experimental findings and intervention findings that suggest that when you change their mind about that, whether you prime them to believe in a kind of growth mindset or in a kind of more changeable version of that trait, within the experiment, or if you kind of intervene over time, then you see corresponding changes in their actual activation toward goals and their symptom change, etc. I think it replicates widely enough across different groups and different domains of study. And I do think that generally the zeitgeist has kind of turned in the direction of, I haven't heard any attempts to criticize the sort of robustness and replicability of that finding, at least in recent years. What I hear is either attempts to discredit the interpretation. Okay, well, sure, we believe, it's good to believe in it, but that doesn't mean that we have it. And sure, it's an opiate of the masses, let them believe, but that doesn't make it true. And I think Sam Harris,
maybe the relevant
where he specifically addressed
maybe it would be like an amphetamine.
He's of course not claiming that
it would be an amphetamine of the masses if it was something that makes them more active. But so what
actually,
your response to Ben? So Ben's saying Sheldon's relying on a study, or the first of the studies he does is one that fell victim to the replication crisis, or was shown up by the replication crisis. What you're saying is this is a finding that's based on a lot of different studies in different subfields, and that robustness is itself a kind of replication, and then maybe some of those studies have replicated themselves. Is that the idea?
I mean, I raised this because not because I thought the finding itself was suspect, because it makes intuitive sense that you would, if you, just like the Stoics who made the lazy argument, or the people who made the argument they were responding to, said, if I can't make a difference for the rest of my life, what's the point? Why go on? It seems like that's going to have an effect on your life. This particular experiment, notwithstanding, regardless of the outcome of it.
And one general question is how much of psychological experimentation, whether one agrees with it or disagrees with it, right? Like whether it's the finding is true or false, let's say, how much of it is actually legitimately finding something, and how much is it sort of empirically laundering things that we believe otherwise? Maybe we have good reasons for believing them otherwise, or maybe we have bad reasons for believing them otherwise. But you get a bunch of undergraduates in the lab, and you have them march through something, and you measure some stuff, and maybe you p-hack it, or maybe you do whatever, and then you come out with some numbers at the end, and now you can have a name which you can put in brackets with a year at the end of your sentence, or when you say the thing that you were perfectly willing to say anyway, and it's all just a kind of charade. I mean, that's the kind of least positive view you could have of psych research, and I think that's probably true of some psych research. To what extent are we actually learning things?
Speaking as one of its offenders at times. I mean, I've found myself, and Greg, over the years, I've come to you for sage counsel or just to vent about these in my own inner conflicts when it comes to the kinds of studies that I'm called upon to run, or the kinds of hypotheses I'm called upon to test. And how often can I say, yes, my belief in this hypothesis depends on the data that falls out of this experiment, versus obviously this is true. Now let me see if I can get away with arguing that in a research paper based on the data I've collected. And the fact is that this happens all the time.
I mean, if you reframed these things in terms of, look, I'm sure that believing there's nothing you can do about XYZ is going to impact how much you do of XYZ. I know that, right? I don't know how many people are doing that, or I don't know how much it affects it. I'm not making a finding. I'm not finding that this is an aspect of human nature. I'm just getting statistics about the distribution of people and how the size of the impact. I think that would be a world of difference.
Yes. Knowledge isn't just about, is some proposition true or false? What you know isn't sentences, isn't proposition. It's facts. It's things out in the world. It's the impact of belief that you have no agency on how you live, right? That's the thing that you know.
Yeah.
And you can know more and more about that. So if you know that there is an impact of believing you have no agency on how you live, or on the contrary, believing you have agency on how you live, if you know those things have an impact, you can think about, well, can I measure that impact? How much more can I know about that impact? Is that impact detectable in this kind of situation or not? Is it like there's more to know about it? And I think psychological research done well and healthily is about that kind of thing.
So, and if I can just go to a specific thing here. So because he says, maybe determinism is true, and I just want to kind of show how a belief in your agency has these effects. In fact, he defines autonomy as sort of believing you have control, not you having control. And so the studies about autonomy show that like believing you have control does this. But it would be far more, to me, it would be more interesting. I think for humanity, it would be more valuable if you could try to distinguish cases where we can tell that the person doesn't have control over this thing. They believe they have control. What does that do? Versus they have control and we believe from introspection they have control of some kind.
Yeah, and this is important and could help split some important, like I can think of someone I knew who was an addict who believed they had a lot more control over certain things than they did. And that belief was not good for them, right? And there was control that they had over their life, but they were not finding the loci of that control, and the person passed away as a result of it.
So crucially, the brunt of the research Sheldon has done concerns not the locus of control, which he says some stuff about, mostly citing outdated research, in those early chapters. But the brunt of his research is on the extent to which you're choosing to do things for reasons of your own, right? The extent to which you are, in fact, exercising your agency in the goals you adopt and put energy toward pursuing. And this is, for me, an example, kind of returning to, Greg, you were saying, kind of what can we learn about the phenomenon by looking to these kinds of empirical findings, and what have I actually gained from reading the various papers Sheldon's published over the years. This is where, for me, it's been really instructive and really kind of unblocked my work in a lot of ways to know that single items to the effect of I am pursuing this sport, or I'm engaged in my academic goals because I would feel ashamed or guilty if I didn't, or I am pursuing these goals because I wholeheartedly believe that they are important to pursue and I endorse them as values. That single statements like that can actually elicit from people the kind of insight and awareness that I would have otherwise been approaching much more tentatively and cautiously and over a long period of time, and asking them sort of roundabout questions to get at it. And also the fact that it can very quickly kind of prime insight for people of the sort that normally you don't get through self-report measures. You have to do these kind of more roundabout, implicit tasks, like he described, these like pictures, and there's questionable validity to them anyway, but that you can pretty quickly elicit certain introspective insights from people by asking questions in a certain form, and that those can be really durable and really predictive over time. Like they're not just giving me a kind of momentary, a kind of temperature read that would change 10 minutes later if I asked them, well, but why are you doing it now? But that actually it tends to tap into something that's fairly enduring and fairly stable. And that it also makes a difference whether you ask somebody before they've chosen or after they've chosen. He talks about that in the book, right? That if you ask somebody why they would pursue the XYZ out of these 3 goals they could currently select in the study, they actually end up selecting a better goal than if you ask them 1 minute after they've selected the goals, why are you going to pursue this goal? Like those have been really instructive in terms of how I pace interventions, in terms of what questions I ask participants. And I don't think I would have been able to just deduce all of that knowledge from first principles, from propositions.
Gena, I wanted to ask you more about this subject, because this is the subject that I feel like I got the most from the book on. Although, and I have the sense that there's something importantly true here, but at the same time, it seems like it's come wrapped in a package that I don't quite understand and is perhaps somewhat incoherent. This is especially true with regard to the issue of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation,
Yep.
where it seems like there's something very right about what he's saying, and especially from the perspective of someone who's a teacher or a parent or a manager, you want to be able to allow your children or students or employees to have the maximum amount of autonomy where they're doing something because, to put it in his terminology, they're intrinsically motivated by it, as opposed to only doing it because of an extrinsic reward or punishment. And that's really crucial to their being happy and their being successful in the activity. At the same time, when I look at the way the research is conducted, and the way that this is supposed to relate to the issue of freedom versus determinism, I'm confused, because the suggestion, at least, is that when you're doing something only for an extrinsic reward, that's a sense in which you're not in control. And for me, this just doesn't ring true. I mean, it maybe does on certain issues, but not on others. There's certain things where I know I don't like doing it. I'm not, quote unquote, intrinsically motivated, but I still feel totally in control because I know I want the reward. And there's no sense, to me, it seems like a kind of warmed over the psychology of Marxist exploitation theory coming out of the 60s. And they're trying to explain what alienation is and what's wrong with it. And but that maybe they've discovered something important in the course of doing it. And I wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah. So, not to insert shameless self-promotion here, but it does so happen that this aspect bothers me so much. I've written on it pretty explicitly in a Substack post called "There's No Such Thing as Intrinsic Motivation." So I kind of tackled it head on, and I was very much tackling the self-determination theorists' concept of intrinsic motivation, which is the mainstream concept. They're the ones who kind of popularized this idea. And I think what you're saying is pretty spot on, that there's like an underlying philosophy of kind of ethics and human nature, and there's a kind of underlying, but I don't know if Marxism describes it best, but like a conglomeration of mind-body kind of disunity, and an assumption that labor, that production is inherently exploitative and bad. And it feels like a kind of Aristotelian, like pre-Rand ethos of virtue should be an end in itself ultimately, and that there's a real failure to recognize the survival value of the virtues and principles that we hold dear, and in turn that are psychologically valuable for us to develop. Anyway, a lot more.
I think in a way it's deeper than that even. I've been a critic of this kind of dualism about motivation, which you see in the self-determination literature, but you see it shot through philosophy, the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value, and it goes back to Plato and Aristotle for sure. And indeed, Aristotle thinks the best thing is this kind of thinking that God does that has no use. And indeed, anything that's useful is thereby, anything whose goodness comes from its use is thereby worse than something whose goodness is intrinsic. So that there is something, I think, wrong about that, but it's quite deeply wrong throughout the culture. And it's not something that's distinctive to self-determination theorists. It's just the way in which a certain bubble under humanity's rug is, that you can push around the bubble under the rug. The way that bubble is coming up in them, which is somewhat different than how it came up in the Marxists and somewhat different than how it comes up in the Aristotelians. What's distinctive about the self-determination theorists is the focus on that it matters whether your motivation comes from you or whether it comes from other people, whether your motivation is first-handed or second-handed, whether it's understood or not understood. And as the theory develops over time, it gets better. So in the original DC and Ryan version, there's extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, which is the way you find it also in Montessori education and other places. As it develops further, you get these levels of how internalized or integrated is the motivation, how much have you made it yours, and in fact, how first-handed has it become, even if it came from without. But it is still somewhat package dealt with this ideal of a motivation that's it's just fun in the moment and there's no causality to it. There's no trying to get anything from it.
Tell me if I'm getting this right, Gena. The concept of the identified motivation, he doesn't quite show how that maps onto the intrinsic versus extrinsic. Is his idea that things that weren't once intrinsically motivated can become intrinsically motivated when you identify with them? Or is he saying this is a third category of motivation? That to me, that struck me as the more important insight, that you can identify with almost any kind of activity, and it kind of bridges the gap between this dichotomy. What is your take on that?
Yeah. So he's drawing on a larger framework within the DC and Ryan self-determination theory literature that Greg is referring to, that has advanced to a level has advanced to a perspective on which they describe a continuum of internalization, and they retain intrinsic motivation as this holy grail sort of at the top of it, but they de-emphasize that distinction, the intrinsic versus extrinsic distinction, as the important one. And instead, what they newly emphasize is the extent to which it's yours. So what Greg's talking about, kind of, I think their own take on first-handedness. Maybe we should give an example of this, by
the way, since we're throwing a lot of terminology around.
Absolutely. So the example of, why do you exercise, right? A really common one. So on the DC and Ryan / Sheldon kind of internalization framework, you could exercise for reasons that are relatively more externally controlled or relatively more autonomous or internalized. And on the externally controlled side, the most extreme form of external control would be, I just go to the gym because my wife will yell at me if I don't, or because, somebody's going to be upset with me. I'll be punished somehow if I don't, or she'll praise me if I do. It could go either way, carrot or stick. Then one level up on that continuum is introjection. So I go to the gym because I will feel better about myself. If I do, I'll feel like a better person, or I'll feel bad about myself. I'll feel guilty. I'll feel gross. I'll feel ashamed if I don't go to the gym. Why? Well, just because that's my kind of undigested, kind of wholly swallowed conception of good, bad. And then there's this
the idea of it as an interject
kind of
is that
motivation.
It feels like something.
Yeah.
Sorry, the idea of it being an
it
interject
feels external,
is that
even though
it's experienced to you as something separate from your normal motivational state that's kind of finger wagging or yelling at your motivation. So it's not like my teacher or my wife or my mother will yell at me, but there's something in me, which Gena calls your drill sergeant, that will yell at me if I do what I want to do. Right. So that's the interjected motivation.
Right.
And then where does
or if I don't do it. Exactly. Or if I don't do what I don't want to do. Exactly. And then crucially, the point where you cross over to the internalized, to the kind of positive, the good side of the continuum, according to the self-determination theorists, is when you get to identified motivation. And identified motivation is, it's not intrinsic. It doesn't necessarily, you don't have fun doing it every moment of, it's not pleasant, but you do it for reasons of your own. And then you get to integrated motivation, where it's just part of who I am at this point. Like, it's just so clear to me that this is how, if I don't exercise, like, my life's not going well, and I'm going to be, it'll be gross, partly because I won't be as energetic. I won't be showing up for my kids in the same way. I say that I'm like faking this because this is not how I feel about exercise at all. But, I could sort of project for someone who's managed to integrate it. Like, it's just part of their identity now and part of their value system. And I do think that what they're talking about is roughly maps on to our understanding of first-handedness versus second-handedness.
So
superficial.
Very first-handed people still enjoy getting likes on a tweet that they sent. Very first-handed people get a shout dopamine, finding $20 in their pocket or getting a raise, right? Or for various things, right? All of those things, say for like Aristotle, are external goods, honor, money. In the case of honor, it's at a far remove from your self-regard or the regard of those you hold in regard and love. In the case of money, it's a medium of exchange. So any value it has is just for other things, or as a marker of what having acquired it meant. Yeah. But those are all going to be extrinsic motivation.
So this is where, we can parse what Greg was describing as like the kind of pre-Rand Aristotle on and Plato on down error of the intrinsic versus extrinsic from what's really distinctive and good in the theory that allows you to correct the theory from within. And this is actually what I do in that let me say this, Jason. So in no such thing as intrinsic motivation piece, the interesting thing, which I think speaks to both sides of what we're talking about, is that DC and Ryan's framework helps me make the case against their own intrinsic motivation concept. Because what I'm able to do is really follow the logic of internalization through. Like if internalization is the state of having really thought through and really being able to kind of fully, clearly, first-handedly see the value in what you're doing for yourself in terms of your life as a whole. And if we really take seriously that understanding of what internalization is, then here are all the cases where you should want to make money and where money should be meaningful to you and where money is absolutely an identified or integrated, form of incentive, form of motivation. Here are the cases where students should want to excel at their homework and where, grades. So I kind of tackle some of the Montessori progressive education kinds of examples. And so we end up with a picture where the better parts of their theory allow us to actually make a kind of compelling and I think vivid case and sort of illustration of why of how it is that we come to value, to kind of personally, spiritually imbue value in quote instrumental and practical ends.
Generally, no one in the history of thought has anything to. In the whole history of thought, causality and value have come apart. If any part of the reason why something's good is because it leads to something else, then that goodness has to be the goodness of the other thing, and this thing is not good in itself, and it's worse for it. And something that would be really good and fully good and good in the best way would be good totally irrespective of its effects. That's how the history of thought has thought about value and cause, pretty much to a man. And it doesn't really make sense, and so there are all kinds of ways to get around it. But like, what's the exception to that? So that's totally here, and it's bad that it's here, but it's just endemic in human thinking, and it needs to be rooted out.
But what's cool is it's not fully here, because they call this scale the internalization of causality scale. They call it, so they don't call it locus of control. They call it locus of causality. So like, do you see yourself, aka your needs, your judgment, your reasons, your other goals as the cause of you taking this action? And that to me is profound and actually a step forward from the traditional separation of, well, I'm just doing it as for itself and for no further reason, or it's a bad reason.
But
is that the self-determination in self-determination theory then? Is that what they mean by self-determination? Self being the cause?
You determine the causes of your own actions.
There are two issues of cause.
You through your thinking and
there's
values.
The extent to which the self is the cause of the action, which you have represented in the history of thought. And so that's the efficient cause side of it, to use Aristotle's term. But there's the final cause side of it. Does the fact that yourself is doing it, but does the fact that you're doing it to get an effect
for these reasons, and that's what they're on about.
But
they're on about like,
kind of
do you have your own reasons for doing it?
Yeah, but that's the kind of
cause like the identified motivation.
The tradition gets right, and I don't think they get right yet. Although I think they're gesturing,
but they're getting
towards something good.
Is the point?
So let me ask you: we've been talking about self-determination theory. We talked a little bit about what it means for an action to be self-determined according to this theory, but there's another, what I imagine must be an aspect of the meaning of that name we haven't talked about, which is what it is to determine the self, what it is to build a self. And there's a whole view of what the self is that goes along with this. And he has a chapter and a half about this. And here again, as with the issue of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation that we talked about earlier, I have the sense that there's something important here, but that it's again coming, at least for me, in a very kind of confusing package. And that's because on the one hand, we're told that the self is a fiction, that it's not really real. But then in another sense, it isn't a fiction. It's real. And I'm trying to get clear on what he means by this. Is his point that, well, the part that's fictional is the idea that there's a Cartesian entity ego, but that it's still quite real that the self is a kind of process? And then what is this process that he thinks the self is? And in
A
what way?
representation
He
of the
brings in the
brain,
issue of the
what he said.
symbolic self. And here I take it that his view is that the self is something constituted by the symbols of the language that we use to tell a story about who we are. And it's a story that can be true. It's a story that can be false. A big part of what seems valuable about his presentation is his claim that the story you tell about yourself can be true, it can be false. Some people have false views of who they are, and that connects to the things that they see as their goals, the goals they're setting for themselves. When they set goals based on a false portrait of who they are, that leads to only being extrinsically motivated and therefore not being very happy. So who wants to comment on first just what is his view here? It's a little unclear to me. And then what do you think about it? Is it true? Is it false? Is it valuable?
At one point, he says that the symbolic self represents the states of the brain. And it's one of these places where people using this term representation and not knowing what it's talking about gives you something that could mean a lot of different things. None of them, I think, correct, but
I mean, the reductionism seems to come in again at that point when he talks about how the default, the DRM is maybe what the self is. But then you can bracket that and just talk about some of the other stuff too.
There are a bunch of things going on in this section,
other place,
and I find them all hazy and distracting. Some of them are interesting and could be reformulated in other ways where there might be something to them, but I still think the formulations are bad, and some of them I just think are wrong. And one of the things that's sort of interesting, but I don't like the way it's formulated, and I don't know whether it's true, but it's sort of an interesting research area, is so there's this thing in the brain, the default network, and it's got different names at different times. Gena and I were talking about this a lot. I remember back when you were in grad school and reading fMRI studies or whatever about it. And there's some question as to how does that relate to the self and the locus of control? And I'm forgetting what I got now from Sheldon and what I got from Mitchell, but it turns out there's a lot of evolution in the understanding of how this thing works and when it's active and inactive over time. And it seems like an interesting thing to study science. It's an interesting thing in the brain to study and think about what conscious phenomena it relates to. I don't know the answer to that, but if it relates to, so that's one kind of set of questions. How does the default network relate to the self and to freedom and control and so forth? There's this other terminology that he sometimes kind of mixes with it about the symbolic self, and it almost seemed like Jungian or Campbellian or something. I'm not sure exactly what the history of it is. I found it obscure and not a good lens to think about this.
I think some of that comes from early days of the cognitive revolution, where we're talking about some kind of representation and it has some functions. But when I think the weakest chapter, which is about AI and where he makes all kinds of crazy speculations and things, he seems totally it's very unclear whether he thinks in the end just having consciousness or not is necessary for having a self. And I kind of think like if your concept, sometimes he says like, but is there a person there? But then he'll also say, yeah, but what you would just really need is there are bits of information it has access to and things it doesn't have access to. So there's some bottom up and some top down. And it doesn't like say, hey, this thing can't be dead inside, it has to have qualia or something. It doesn't like just say that. And I think like, if you think you could even maybe have a self with no consciousness, what the hell are you talking about? Now, I think he probably thinks when he thinks of it, he thinks of something in our head. But it's...
I mean, he talks about it needing to have feelings. So I think he means for it to need a consciousness. But he also doesn't seem to associate consciousness necessarily with anything biological or to think it's that, he has a kind of disembodied idea of, well, what would it take to be conscious? Anyway, but that I agree with you that is a weak chapter. probably not worth trying to quibble over.
I guess my feeling here is just that all right. He mentions several key functions of the symbolic self, which I think is supposed to end up being like this belief, well, like this complex in my head about that that filters things through, that I talk to, that I say I am, that has this story, that it's like my conception of me, but maybe it's my consciousness, maybe not. It sounds more like my representation of me as a person.
And it's seen as in contrast to others. It's like this Salarzian Hegelian story about how we get the concept of self as opposed to concept of others.
Yeah, it's so there's some I thou and I it kind of stuff going on there. And then he mentions a bunch of functions that it has. And he talks about, now the various things he names, I think, yes, a concept of self is connected to these things. But I don't know. This thing bothered me. Maybe this isn't a big point, but it bothered me that one of the things that it's supposed to do is sort of defend itself against certain kinds of information coming in that would challenge it. Now, I think we have to make sense of the idea that everybody, even the most, first-handed and rational person, can sometimes get defensive if something might challenge them. But some more, some less. But he specifically points to places where people are rationalizing about their own motives, and they are rationalizing to protect this picture of themselves. To his credit, he thinks people can have a false picture of themselves. But what's not, I think, to his credit is there is this point of choice, a key point of choice that, Gena, that you would talk about of intellectual honesty or integrity, where you have a choice to try to choose facts, and that's really important.
And why isn't that a function of the ego?
Yeah,
knowing the world.
And instead,
I think he sloppily
you
implies that it is in various places. But anyway, go on. I don't think he ever comes out and says it or is consistent.
Doesn't make the list though,
because it's not his list, right? He's borrowing it from this other dude or dudette. I guess he added a fourth one. And the fourth one has as an implication, like you honestly model your own personality and internal states, or you bullshit yourself about it. But he never makes that explicit.
You're right. He does add that. And again, he is not personally responsible for Western thought or even the problems left in Aristotle. But there is a way in which Aristotle is better than him in terms of forming your values habitually, whereas he is much more on this picture of deep inside there are these things that you're going to like, and people have to discover them, and then you just find it, and maybe you're lying to yourself that you found it, and if you pick this extrinsic stuff, it's definitely not going to work. And
I agree that this is a real weakness.
And Aristotle's better than that.
Bits that are better and bits that are worse on just this topic. But
it's not that whether you desire and enjoy doing good things or desire or enjoy doing bad things is just something that it's sort of built in, but you might have mistakes about which one.
Part of the problem with Aristotle is he's too concerned myopically on whether the things you enjoy are good or bad. There's not enough concern on, look, there are plenty of good things. You enjoy this one and I enjoy that one, and I ought to enjoy this one because it fits better with the other things I enjoy. So Aristotle's moral psychology, or Aristotle's psychology, is focused on virtue and vice to the exclusion of personal values. And that's a shortcoming of it. These guys are focused on personal values to the exclusion of virtue and vice, which is a shortcoming of it. But they're different shortcomings.
But you don't think, especially in a theory of self-determination, you don't think it would be important not just to talk about you identify with this over time, but actually how something becomes a
Oh
value
no, you
for
definitely need it.
Sure.
He does talk about that. I mean, but he does talk about that. Not enough, but he talks about, initially you end up going and taking care of your sick mom or whoever in an introjected way, and then over time you notice that there are actually things you value about it, or at some point you realize, actually I need to set boundaries because this is really hurting me, in other parts of my life. There are various examples like that.
Well, so sometimes he talks about you're making mistakes and you can learn, but other times he's running an experiment that shows as people get older, they'll switch to identified rather than interjected. And I mean, that may be true for certain things, but or he'll talk about the Rogers, the kind of psyche keeps the score. Somehow you just know if this is agreeing, and there's a sense in which that's true.
Valuing,
guilt and chronic anxiety. What?
There's a sense in which it's true and a sense in which it's not, is I think what we're arriving at. And I think he's getting at the senses in which it's true, but not the senses in which it's not.
One general question for us here, not a question we can decide now, but a question we could note as behind this, is what does progress in fields that are shaped and influenced by bad philosophy look like? Here's one way it could look.
Mm-hmm.
All the philosophical problems are solved by someone prior to that person gets into the field or someone influenced by them.
Thanks,
they
guys.
then, in a row, going from the deepest issues to the most superficial ones, fix them. And then 100 years later, we started at A as A, and we've got a better theory of management of this kind of corporation and a better psychology, and physics is all sorted. Obviously, that's a parody. It can't happen that way. I think it also doesn't happen with some little empirical research finding is discovered with no philosophical influence on how it's interpreted or thought about, and somehow that leads to everything being fixed. How progress in fields look is messy, and people come in with some philosophical premises that are on the right track. They observe some things that don't make sense to them and try to fix them. And there's a kind of, a lot of slopping around in the middle, where by the middle I mean from the deepest, philosophical things to the most empirical findings, where people are doing kind of work that's working towards clarifying things. Some people are working towards obfuscating them. People are on the right track and on the wrong track. But there can be improvements in a field, improvements even that are going towards fixing some of the philosophical problems with the field, that are happening in a situation where the field remains with a lot of fundamental philosophical confusions that have not been cleared up, and that are not going to be cleared up if all we get is what's going on now. Nevertheless, some of what's going on now could be for the good. And I think some of that's happening in psychology. It's a little hard to separate the different currents and cross currents when one's not in the field and one's just reading around in it. But my sense is that there are some good things going on here, but they're in a context that's got a lot wrong with it. And that wrong with it infects it and affects it.
So I think this is, compare this, say, to what economics did sort of for free market thinking, as against just political philosophy. Now you might think there was political philosophy in the background, or political philosophies popularized some of this stuff. There's a sense in which economists kind of studying this phenomenon and that phenomenon time and again showed, that this kind of state control doesn't work and so on. Now, that doesn't stop states from continuing to do it. That doesn't even stop the economists from maybe a moral case. So what we just say, if it doesn't work. But it does seem like a whole lot more is sort of discovered, and it has a kind of bigger gestalt impact in drawing people to the kind of a capitalist or liberty way of thinking. Then I think this is done. Now maybe, you got to give it more
Stay
time.
tuned.
Maybe it'll keep going well. I would also say CBT and DBT, in terms of positive thing they've done, they dwarf this. Now, of course, they're meant to be direct interventions, right? But still, even in terms of
they're informed by some of the same stuff.
They say is true, and they don't say a lot of stuff that's false. They're better there too. I mean, it's not that
I'm not going to argue.
has taken something away from the world. Well, you know it better. You know it infinitely better than I do, so you would know.
I know infinitely.
I think think we're all agreed that when there's progress in a field, it's not going to be that the field is revolutionized overnight. It's going to happen gradually. But I think we're probably also all agreed that for at least those of us who have an idea of what the progress should look like, it's helpful to have philosophers who can provide some standards, who can comment on that progress, who can hold up a certain ideal toward which we think they should progress. I think that's what we've been trying to do in this discussion. I think we've done a pretty good job, I hope. We should wrap up soon. Does anyone have any last final thoughts they want to make about the book before we close?
And I have something on that idea of progress. So which of us should go first? Jason, maybe I should go first because mine's less on the book, and then you can go on to the book.
Yeah.
So I don't want to have the idea that philosophers know or should know just how psychology should be, or economics, or some other field. I don't think you think that either. That we have it in our back pocket, and we're like, we could wave it, and we could motivate the psychologist to get the answer that we have in the back of the book. There are
well, not the answers to the scientific questions, but when we see big philosophic errors that we think,
I think there are real
that's the thing I think
errors in the field, in most fields, right? But what those errors are doing is hamstringing kind of progress that needs to get made in that field that you couldn't do from philosophy, right? And I don't think you could expect to fix all the philosophy before the errors are fixed. You have to go in kind of where we are in life. Just like in life, you don't fix someone's philosophy first and then they go and live their life. You have to fix it while they're living their life. And like if you have a psychological problem, you don't take 10 years off of your life and solve your psychological problems, and then you can go on living. You do it in the process.
Are you applying self-determination theory to the progress of self-determination theory?
The question is, I just don't want to have this we the philosophers know how it should be, and then maybe the poor theorists in the field will work it out if we have a good enough influence on them. I think the right way to think of any specialized field is there are people in here doing work. They're trying to discover things. Sometimes they really are discovering things. If I have philosophical criticisms of the field or the method, and I think they're wrong about it, I have to know that going in and know how to choose judiciously and read judiciously and separate the wheat from the chaff. But I should have a wheat-seeking premise, not just a chaff-seeking premise. And I should expect to have to go through a lot of chaff to find bits of wheat.
Well, so look,
Jason, is your comment about the wheat or about the chaff?
About the book, I think.
Good question.
The whole grain.
I think that there's the question of sort of what can you figure out from philosophy, and what does that even mean for philosophy to figure it out? Some things are sort of self-evident, other things are drawn from the wealth of human experience and history, other things from introspection. Exactly what is in philosophy or psychology, or even if you need to draw those lines exactly, I think is probably harder for philosophy and psychology than any other special science. At least it is for me. I think that and so and it may even be that at a certain point things will look like, well, maybe some philosopher came up with this, but we really think of that as a psychological result, and here I don't know. So, and I'm certainly not a Cartesian or a Platonist. I'm not trying to dictate from Wolffian. I'm not trying to dictate from first principles the details of chemistry or the chemistry of the soul, for that matter. I am rather kind of focused on what implicitly is the sort of philosophical perspective here. And the reason I say that, there's also just psychology, as a special science that gives you far more granularity and other things than the philosophy will. But the reason I'm doing that is because this is a popular book. So you guys have both met Sheldon. You guys have read a number of his and DC's research papers. I haven't, right? I read this book. So you're in a position, I think, to better appreciate what it was, or what, in effect, you can't help but read the book, but kind of knowing where this was going and what the best version of it is, so that even if it's not the best version in the book, you kind of know about that. And I think when you popularize a book, I think it's exceedingly rare. I think you can popularize a book without sacrificing. You have to give up certain levels of precision, but you don't have to sacrifice truth, I don't think. And I've even seen a few popular books by scholars that simultaneously make the basic ideas available to a general audience and advance the specialized field. That's super hard. But see The Origin of Species, or something like that. But I think when I think of this as this is a popular book, right? If there was somebody who I thought should really know the scholarship, I'd say these are people working on this. They've got some really good papers or that. And I think if I was giving this to somebody, it would be with the idea of what kind of what is it they're hoping to learn or change their mind about or just become informed about, and then qua popularization of this, what's the best thing? And at that point, I think you're apt for some of it to maybe be in psychology, but other places where you might get that idea better in philosophy. So for example, I still would probably, in terms of thinking about whether we have control or not, my first thing I'd probably talk about would be bad faith. And I might, eventually mention this stuff. And I wouldn't recommend Sartre because that's so hard to understand if it even is intelligible. But but it's at that level that my frustration is, or that I wouldn't recommend it, because again, I think his heart is in the right place. I think I learned a lot of interesting things, or I should say, I learned about many interesting things I didn't know about, and I'm glad that they're being done.
It's definitely not the place to start reading about psychology or
other context.
So on that note, I think we will have to leave it at, you'll have to determine for yourself if you want to read this book. I hope we have given you some material and information that you would use to make that decision for yourself, by yourself, for your own purposes. I think we should wrap up the conversation at this point because we've been going for about 2 hours. I want to thank all of you for a very interesting conversation. I think we brought out really some interesting themes, what is valuable, what is not valuable about this book, and pointing toward perhaps other titles in this same field that we may want to explore in the future.